Markedly a time of great struggle in United States history, the period between 1929 to 1939 is known for the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, both historically significant periods of economic and cultural collapse. The Golden Age of Hollywood period occurred around the same time. Considered to have begun in 1915 with the historically inaccurate movie The Birth of a Nation, it was actually a time of more liberal approaches to subjects of cultural interest. It is often associated with glitz and glamour, being marked by first the silent era from 1915 to 1929 before audio became possible for film, and secondly the pre-code era from 1929 to 1934. During the pre-code era, studios had all the creative freedom that sound provided with little of the puritanical, religiously influenced oversight that would come to be once the Hays Code began negatively impacting films. The Hays Code made such an impact on Hollywood to signify a pre- and post-period of film and the types of films made during both periods into two separate, distinct categories. Remembering Hollywood's Hays Code 40 Years On by Bob Mondello on NPR describes the pre-code time up until 1922 as, quote, come to seem like a moral quagmire, even by the bathtub gin and speakeasy standards of the Roaring Twenties, referring in particular to the scandals that had overtaken Hollywood at the time. Some of the scandals that created enough outrage for the Hays Code to take hold of the industry are noted in the NPR article as various stars dying of drug overdoses and murders linked directly to the community. The article goes on to state that under Postmaster General Will Hays, the Hollywood studios decided to self-impose restrictions, but due to this list having no real consequences, nothing much came of it. The Wexner Center for the Arts notes that in 1933, the movie I'm No Angel starring Mae West simultaneously saved Paramount from bankruptcy and took things far enough for calls, both manufactured and real, internal and external, for studios to crack down on the Hays Code restrictions seriously. Mondello went on to write that the Hays Code had strong influence from the religious community and stated to want to have a production code that considered what they felt to be good taste. During this time, a great push to not negatively influence audiences grew, drawing a connection between movies and perceived failing societal morals, quote, that no picture should ever lower the moral standards of those who see it, and implying that depicting evil, crime, and wrongdoing would cause audiences to emulate that behavior in the real world. The list included bans on the don'ts and be carefuls, which included nudity, mocking religion, drug use, addiction, interracial relationships, revenge, crimes that could be imitated, and so on. To enforce this code, American theaters, owned at the time by the studios that wanted to enforce the code, did not allow a movie to be played that didn't meet the standards and receive a certificate. In some of the movies after Hays Code became enforced, around 1934, you can still see the certificate numbers listed on the title pages of some films, indicating they complied with the regulations. Something else of note at the time of these movies' creation and original popularization is the culture that film studios did want to have on audiences, and the significant role that media had become in shaping society. According to the Kennedy Center's Part X, Hollywood and Radio in the 1930s, movies became an escape during this decade. While being relatively affordable, movies often depicted lives dissimilar to the harsher realities of the viewer's circumstances. The same article goes on to explain that at the time, movies became the only place for people to get warm and rest. Movies provided a literal escape from hunger, dust, misery, and various other anxieties of the time. Movies began to serve another purpose during this time, bringing communities together and inspiring people to believe in the American dream again. Escape movies became a trend, and the portrayals of excellence and success helped to boost Hollywood, California's reputation of being, quote, haven of opportunity. The Universal Horror Monsters movies in this video, the first part of a 3-part series, are all Universal Studios made movies based on gothic fiction elements. In contrast to the happy, light image of life that escape movies portrayed, Universal Pictures Studio, newly headed by Carl Laemmle Jr., became the leading producer of horror films during the 30s. Britannica details how these movies, the Universal Monster movies, became known for being characteristically low-budget films that allowed Universal, one of the little 3 studios at the time, to stay afloat during financial hard times. Commercially successful in the box office, the movies created a genre out of necessity that would go on to transform cinema forever. Having created the horror movie niche with the various monsters, Carl Jr. helped transition the studio into talkies after they faced challenges under his father's management. Article Universal Studios and the Rise of Horror Films notes that Universal was financially strapped and took advantage of gothic elements on sets that they could use for various projects. In a 1998 documentary, Kingdom of Shadows: The Birth of Cinema, The word monster is explained as having derived from Latin, meaning divine warning, connecting this to not only the way that the authors Shelley, Stoker, and Wells used the monstrous characters in the stories they wrote, but the way those stories are reimagined for various other media and time periods. The birth of cinema makes a clear distinction between what does and does not qualify as a monster, stating that monsters have to be displayed, are a warning that lessons can be learned from. The idea being that the threat of a monster is a tool to govern and encourage people to behave in ways the community sees as morally and ethically good. For example, Frankenstein is a lesson in the negative outcomes to defying God and trying to upset the natural order, something of great concern when the novels were written in the 19th century. The 19th century, or the period between 1800 and 1899 according to Decade by Decade Timeline of the 1800s on thoughtco.com, has similar themes to those that tinge society today. The Victorian era in particular, described as 1837 to 1901, is one of, quote, expanding horizons of education and literacy, as well as by an increased desire of the people to question religion and politics, from British Literature Wiki. In the 19th century, though, rather than restrictions to reproductive health care, they battled women's sexuality. Instead of slashers and true crime, they became obsessed with reanimation, immortality purchased with blood, and curses that chain you to the moon. More importantly, people became enthralled with the immoral actions, the wicked whims, and the lures of the dark side. The dark side of you revealed while under the influence of the supernatural. The potential impacts, both perceived and otherwise, associated with women's liberation had become a hot-button topic during both 1818 when Shelley's Frankenstein published and in 1897 when Bram Stoker's Dracula published. During the 19th century, women's suffrage started to become a reality in Western cultures, challenging long-held social structures based on male-led systems. According to the page, The Long Road to Women's Suffrage, on the Historic England website, regional groups of women had become increasingly involved in the suffrage movement by the late 19th century. The first major event of note on the same site is the Manchester National Society for Women's Suffrage moving outside of their city in 1877 to begin more regional organizing that included public meetings in the northern parts of England. The novels that would go on to become the first horror movie monsters originated in England, aside from all being published in the 1800s. Despite Mary Shelley's novel being published a whopping 79 years prior to Stoker's own monster creations, Count Dracula is regarded as the character with the most adaptations of all time. From Guinness World Records website, the character Count Dracula from Bram Stoker's novel has been portrayed in 538 films as of August 2015, with the closest literary character being Sherlock Holmes appearing in 299 films. Not only is Dracula the most portrayed character, but in addition, Bela Lugosi's Count Dracula from the 1931 film is often cited and praised as a key and iconic horror character portrayal that sparked countless others. Despite the image of Dracula being that of Lugosi's, the actual appearance in the book is more similar to that of Nosferatu, with utilizing his vampire abilities, than a charming, intense, but handsome gentleman with a cape and painfully slow advance on prey. Frankenstein is the only character I'd have thought to be the most common, other than Dracula. It's a perfect tale, in part due to its creation during the year without a summer in 1816, Geneva, Switzerland. Inspired in large part by the ideas at the time surrounding death, women, place in the world, science, and the nature of life in combination with the challenge issued to a group of friends spending their summer stuck inside. Another friend in the same group would write and publish a short story titled The Vampire in 1819 about fears surrounding corrupt aristocracy, according to From Monsters to Victims by Caitlin Orlomowski with the University of Connecticut. The idea that monsters could hide among those with status, money, and influence became a theme amongst the Universal monster movies of this time. Orlomowski also states that this is the first portrayal of a vampire as a gentleman or nobleman, a way to depict vampires which is later replicated in the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker. While Shelley's novel started with more intellectually and creatively pure intentions, Stoker's, on the other hand, is the seventh book published by the author whose friends claimed he only wrote for money. Rather, he sought fame in theater and success in his career there. The themes of the 19th century had persisted throughout the decades, and the anxiety surrounding change and the perceived threat from that change, although different, can still be felt in Dracula as much as Frankenstein. Dracula is purely superstitious and supernatural, delving into religion as a weapon against the undead, whereas Frankenstein is mostly scientific with hints of supernatural elements when it comes to the origin of life, and the question of morality surrounding our actions and divine responsibility for those actions. Both of these novels are considered to be gothic fiction of the Romantic period. One of the definitions of the word romantic is of characterized or suggestive of an idealized view of reality from Oxford Languages. All three monsters' stories have romantic tones and motifs based on literature generated from novels considered to be part of the Romantic, Neo-Romantic, and Gothic movements. The Romantic movement is described as artistic and intellectual lean of literature, art, music, etc. from 1790 through 1850 on Britannica's Arts and Culture page dedicated to Romanticism. Originating in Europe, the movement is marked by individualism, the mysteries of life, and introspection. The New York Public Library article, A Brief History of Gothic Horror, by Amanda Pagan, describes Gothic fiction as a subgenre typically featuring morality, philosophy, and religion. Pagan also writes that the endings are not always considered good and cites Mary Shelley's work as a shift in the genre, a switch to the human reflection in the villain. It's easy to draw the connection between this display of monstrosity in the original novels, as well as later movie adaptations that warn people to avoid the scarier aspects of life. Lessons to avoid potential harm to your fellow citizens, to respect laws of nature, and sometimes to accept fate worse than death in exchange for a safe and peaceful society. Or so the story goes. Welcome to the Universal Monsters series, where I'll be diving into the topics already mentioned, some real-world context to the books and movies, as well as reviews of the movies themselves. This video will be a general overview of the three monsters included in the series and the source materials they are based on. Novels: Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley, Dracula by Bram Stoker, and the Universal Picture Studios' creation of the Wolfman. In addition, this series will include more in-depth analysis and review of the monsters and the interpretations they have inspired since their inceptions. Wolfman is about a man given power he doesn't want and desperately wants to get rid of, that represents what the studios were looking to create at the time in order to generate the most commercial success. In contrast to the monsters inspired by literature, this monster is solely studio created and reflects the sentiment of the studio in Hollywood at the time. Much of the character's struggles have to do with human nature, what lies beneath a man's societal exterior. Man, as himself, is the problem, amplified to deadly levels by the werewolf curse, acquired from surviving the bite of a werewolf. At the hands of one man, another meets his own destruction, and that same motif plays out in most of the Universal Wolfman portrayals. By the time that the Wolfman premieres in 1941, the studio is extremely different. In the clutches of being approved for Hays Code compliance certificates in order to play in most theaters, and a necessary Supreme Court decision that required the Big Five studios in Hollywood, which Universal hadn't been a part of, to address their monopolization of the film industry, shaking things up in a big way. Universal monster films associated with the earlier part of that time period gone over in this video will include Dracula and Frankenstein 1931, Werewolf of London in 1933, Bride of Frankenstein 1935, Dracula's Daughter 1936, The Son of Frankenstein 1939. Despite the horror movies being a product of Laemmle's reign of Universal Pictures, they'd proven to be commercially successful and continued into the 40s with Wolfman 1941, The Ghost of Frankenstein 1942, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman 1943, Son of Dracula 1943, House of Frankenstein 1944, and House of Dracula 1945. A lot has changed since the 1930s and 40s, but the attraction to the darker side is a prevalent theme in all monster movies, and that more gloomy and shadowy tilt to the world mirrors sentiments of the 2020s just like they did in the past. Obviously, with hindsight, we can assess some of those quote-unquote lessons as self-serving creations, many of them, like female sexuality leading to societal collapse, or homosexuality being the ultimate sin, to be based on certain people's beliefs rather than universally held truths about humanity. Dracula, first officially featured in the 1931 film under the same name, is one of the most pivotal and prime examples of a universal monster. Most literature and documentaries on the subject agree that Dracula, a foreigner and outsider to England with nefarious intentions, lures women away from their English men and turns them from pious and pure virgins to sexually open and ravenous women who are overtaken with their thirst for blood, thus creating a situation that could cause the downfall of the story. The first Dracula movie, simply titled Dracula, premiered in 1931 and is said to be based on the 1924 stage play of the same name by Hamilton, Deanne, and John L. Balderson. Bela Lugosi famously plays Dracula in the film, which is also the first sound film version of Stoker's novel. The novel begins in Transylvania, Romania, following Jonathan Harker, who is visiting a castle atop a small village in the Carpathian Mountains. The nobleman that Harker has come to visit with a real estate transaction turns out to be Count Dracula, who the town fears and reveres from the safety of their village, using superstitious technique like lining entrances in garlic and wearing crucifixes to protect against being fed upon by the Count and ward off attacks. Unfortunately for Harker, he doesn't heed the warnings and becomes Dracula's prisoner before he puts 2 and 2 together that Dracula and his 3 wives are vampires. As an epistolary novel, or a narrative told through letters or other documents rather than one cohesive one, we jump from Harker's POV as a prisoner in Dracula's castle to his fiancée Mina Murray's letters with Lucy Westerno. The 2 women correspond about Lucy's 3 suitors who later become part of the Dracula hunting party, and they come across the wrecked Russian ship that carried the 50 boxes of dirt from Transylvania that Dracula needs in order to rest in his grave during the day. Mina informs Harker that she saw Lucy sleepwalking in the cemetery with red eyes over her, only to discover that Lucy had 2 tiny red marks on her throat of unknown origin. Due to the weird circumstances surrounding Lucy's ailments and behavior, Dr. Seward, one of her suitors and a doctor at the asylum Mina works at, calls in his mentor, Professor Van Helsing, for assistance. Van Helsing immediately identifies that not only are the weird circumstances with Renfield, the raving lunatic who was found on the ship, and Lucy are not only the result of vampires, but the vampire he's been hunting his whole career, Count Dracula. In an attempt to save Lucy's life, the men perform blood transfusions that fail, and the situation worsens when Lucy's mother succumbs to a heart attack induced by shock. All of their efforts are for naught when Lucy is attacked and killed by a wolf, however. On the other side of Europe, Harker is taken in by nuns while suffering brain fever post-castle escape, and has recovered, now sending for Lucy to join him in Budapest so they can be married. Back in England, Van Helsing, Dr. Seward, and Lucy's 2 other suitors go to her grave under concern that she's going to transition to an undead vampire, despite the men accompanying Van Helsing not believing him. Van Helsing is obviously right, and Lucy has in fact turned into an undead vampire. They all decide to release Lucy's soul by killing her in a rather brutal way and ensuring she can't rise from the dead. Upon Mina and Jonathan's return to Western Europe, they join in the efforts to stop Dracula, which includes burning his supply of dirt from his homeland necessary for him to rest in during daylight hours at risk of perishing otherwise. Assuming his next move, the hunting crew chases Dracula back to Transylvania and kills his wives before he arrives and intercepts him and ultimately kills him. Modernity allows for advancements that make moving internationally with 50 boxes of dirt much easier. Even sending for a businessman from England to assist in the completion of the transaction becomes a simpler task. Similarly, today we grapple with fears about AI and technological advancements that connect us, but could potentially bring harm by doing so. Like in the novel and adaptations, connection brings out some of our most ugly instincts. Adaptations, like the novel, including fears about people we aren't familiar with from places we know little about. The character Dracula is a representation of the fears during the 19th century in England that immigrants would bring with them evil that would spread to English society through susceptible virginal women. For example, Lucy is written like a pick-me of sorts through no fault of her own. Similarly to Mina, she's considered a commodity with a hunting party's worth of protectors and avengers, but unlike Mina, her succumbing to what they believe is the dark side, symbolized by her being with Dracula rather than them, instantly turns their plan deadly. Rather than saving Lucy, they destroy her under a belief they are doing it for her own good. The 1931 movie differs in some big ways. For starters, Renfield is the man who goes to carry out the transaction with the Count in Transylvania. The story begins with him as a red herring protagonist who goes through Harker's experiences at the castle. Renfield ends up being alive on the ship that Dracula uses to transport himself and his dirt to England, and now raving madly he's taken to a sanatorium. Van Helsing uses wolfsbane in the movie as an essential tool to protect against vampires, something not mentioned in the book. Crucifixes are the other essential tool used in the movie, with dramatic ends to drawn out attacks from Dracula. In the film, Dracula takes the form of mist and a bat in addition to a wolf. We don't see but hear howling to call Renfield. Lucy is not in this film adaptation, and only Mina is preyed upon by Dracula, him sneaking into her room through a window and drinking her blood, turning her into one of his minions. Eventually, Dracula flees back to his coffin, and upon hearing Van Helsing and Harker arrive, believes Renfield betrayed him and kills him by breaking his neck. Sunrise arrives, causing Dracula to seek refuge in his coffin, which allows Van Helsing and Harker to drive a stake through his heart, freeing Mina from his control. After Limley legally acquired the rights, Universal Pictures owned the character, but took inspiration from the stage play and the illegal Nosferatu adaptation of the novel. According to the Art of Costume article Designing Fear, Bela Lugosi's Dracula, Raymond Huntley is actually who first slicked their hair back and wore a tuxedo cape combo when portraying Dracula in a stage play. The article in the Art of Costume also states it's possible that either the costume designers or Lugosi brought the look from the stage to the movie. In contrast to this, Stoker's novel describes Dracula as having, quote, a hard-looking mouth with very red lips and sharp-looking teeth, as white as ivory on page 9. In addition, Van Helsing goes on to tell them that he becomes elemental dust in rays of moonlight. So you can essentially enter any place, no matter how small the entry due to this, and can see in the dark. Genuinely, he's OP, according to Stoker, with no shock people would be afraid of. It's rather mundane that the only ways to take him out are to destroy his connection to his homeland, attack him during daylight hours when he's weakest, garlic, and religious symbols. Similar to much of the superstitions and folklore of the area surrounding Transylvania and the Romanian people, specifically those who live nomadically, the Count has no reflection and shapeshifts into animal forms as well as mist/fog. When upset, his originally blue eyes become red, and every time he appears, he looks younger. No matter the age, however, he's always able to do things outside the realm of possibility, like scaling the wall to climb out of the castle, a truly spooky description in the novel. Despite Dracula being the most portrayed character, Frankenstein also came out in 1931, and the Frankenstein story is arguably the one that weaves all of the other Universal monsters together. The full title of the novel by Mary Shelley is Frankenstein the Modern Prometheus, who is a figure in Greek mythology, a trickster. The creation of Frankenstein's monster is a trick on nature, one of the central themes and driving forces behind characters' struggles throughout the plots of the Frankenstein movies. The opening chapter of the book is about the book's background and what inspired the story in the first place. The challenge issued by Shelley's friend Lord Byron in Geneva, the setting of the book. The first version of the book published didn't reveal Shelley's identity, but upon the second publication, she's noted as the author of the book. While the first film adaptation covers the main plot points in similar ways to the book, much of the story is changed to fit the golden Hollywood story rather than the gothic fiction version. Similarly to Dracula, Frankenstein is an epistolary novel, starting with Captain Walton's 18th century letters to his sister Margaret while he explores the North Pole. The movie, on the other hand, begins in a Bavarian Alps village with a nearby medical college where Henry Frankenstein has built a laboratory and a watchtower. Henry has become so engrossed and obsessed with his highly secret experiments that he's gone ghost. In Captain Walton's letters back in the novel, we get more of a backstory and build-up that arguably enhances the fear elements of the story tenfold. The monster itself is the most different aspect between the novel and the movie adaptation. The book's monster being described as having dull, watery eyes, yellow skin that's transparent enough to see the blood vessels underneath, black hair, and black lips. He's extremely strong and physically capable, but has the mind of a baby. In the movies, however, Frankenstein's monster is green with a flat head, stitches all over his body, short cropped hair with black lips, and electric conducting bolts sticking out of his neck. The movie version is the version we commonly think of to represent Frankenstein's monster, or as the creature is colloquially known, Frankenstein, eliminating Victor/Henry altogether. The novel differs so much from the movie that I'll pick back up talking about it in a later video when I go over Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the 1994 film. Once the movie monster is made, Henry and Fritz end up restraining him, fearing what his violent outbursts could lead to. When Fritz goes to the monster, he's attacked, and the other men lock him in, coming up with a plan to let the monster go and then use a drug to kill him when he inevitably attacks. Similarly to the book, Henry is horrified by his creation, scared that himself or someone else could be hurt or killed by the monster. They carry their plan out, and the monster is presumably dead after falling to the floor unconscious, and Waldman reassures that he will perform the autopsy and then destroy the monster. When he goes to perform said autopsy, he's strangled by the monster, who's not dead at all. Henry is none the wiser to this development as he prepares for his wedding to Elizabeth, occurring that next day. The monster escapes the tower laboratory and makes his way through the woods, coming upon a lake with a house nearby. A little girl says goodbye to her father at the house and goes to play by the lake, inviting the monster to join her with childlike innocence. At first, things are fine, but then he becomes upset and throws the little girl into the lake. Unable to swim to shore, the little girl drowns, and the monster runs away into the woods. Another famous scene occurs next. The little girl's father walks through town with the girl's wet, limp body to Castle Frankenstein. As he's walking and people in the town realize what's happening, they join him and form an angry mob that demands answers from the Frankensteins for the girl's death. It is discovered that Waldman had been strangled by the monster, who has made his way to the castle. The sight of the monster causes Elizabeth to pass out, and he escapes with the mob following him. Henry is then attacked by the monster and hurled over the side of the windmill as the mob demands justice below. The dummy body breaks its fall off the windmill by hitting one of the blades, and the people below carry Henry back to the village. The monster goes down with the burning windmill. Angry mob members cheering below at his fear of the fire and eventual demise. Everyone thinks the monster is dead, and the Frankensteins proceed with a wedding, and Henry's father toasts to a future grandchild. The movie Werewolf of London premiered in 1935 and originally had Lugosi cast as Dr. Ugami and Boris Karloff as Dr. Wilfred Glendon. Despite it being not about Lawrence Talbot, the version of the werewolf monster that I'll be covering in this series, it is the first werewolf movie that Universal made and precedes the Wolfman character by about 6 years. Wilfred is a botanist from England who is in Tibet searching for a rare plant that is legendary for being powered by the moon. During his journey, he's bitten by a humanoid creature, but is still able to collect a specimen from the plant he'd been searching for. Some of the nastiest but well-done effects occur in Wilfred's conservatory with this disgusting tentacle creature that's moving around inside of a cage with people observing through bars. The plant consumes a frog, which is as gross as it sounds. During this time, Wilfred is dedicating his focus to the plant specimen from Tibet with the goal to trick the plant to bloom. While he's showing someone the plant, his hand begins to grow fur, and upon seeing this, he rushes them out. Ugami is another doctor who approaches Wilfred about the flower, requesting that he provide him with 2 blossoms of the plant by the full moon. He wants the flowers due to them being an antidote to lycanthropy, a man who believes that he's transforming into a werewolf during the full moon. Unwilling to help him, Wilfred isn't convinced by the 2 examples Ugami gives of men in London, having been bitten by werewolves, surviving the bite, and then becoming a werewolf themselves. Although Wilfred didn't feel inclined to help Ugami, he does use his pro tip and harvest sap from the plant in order to stop his own transformation. Wilfred's wife, Lisa, played by Valerie Hobson, goes to her aunt, Miss Eddie Combs' party with her childhood sweetheart, Paul, played by Lester Matthews, who has intentions to try and get Lisa back. Wilfred stays back and he proceeds to undergo a painful transformation into a werewolf humanoid form. Howling erupts on the streets with Wilfred stays back and he proceeds to undergo a painful transformation into a werewolf humanoid form. Howling then erupts on the streets, which the partygoers hear from inside, but due to only Eddie, known for being a drunk, seeing the werewolf, no one believes her, and Wilfred prowls the streets instead of targeting his wife Lisa. The partygoers only learn the grim truth that a woman got mauled to death on the streets the next day, and some of them begin to piece together something supernatural afoot. Paul informs his uncle, a police chief, about his supernatural suspicions, and the superstitious beliefs are brushed off. In an attempt to not go on a murderous rampage, and with no flower blossom antidote options, Wilfred believes he can lock himself away during the full moon. He breaks out once he's transformed and searches the street for a victim, settling on a young woman meeting up with a lover. Once there's confirmation something supernatural is going on, the police offer to seize the flower from Wilfred in order to stop him transforming into a werewolf. Worry grows that the werewolf curse could become an epidemic that takes over London. Things escalate when Wilfred breaks out of the metal bars to choke his wife, only to run off when Paul and the policemen at the home chase him off. In a technique I hadn't seen in prior films of this time, footage of multiple characters making phone calls are cut over one another to show the efforts to which the group is taking to track Wilfred down over a short period of time. Ugami and Wilfred go back and forth over the flower, Wilfred slicing him and choking him to death, far more violent than I would have expected from a 1930s movie, but this is right around the time that the Hays Code would have been making ripples in Hollywood without fully controlling it yet. Wilfred makes it onto the roof and jumps off to attack Paul. And finally Wilfred is shot from behind and he thanks them for killing him, giving a speech and then dying. Upon his death, Wilfred transforms back into his man form, and the group decides to cover everything up rather than let London know how close they'd come to a werewolf epidemic. Following The Werewolf of London, the first sequel to Frankenstein, titled The Bride of Frankenstein, released in 1935, with Elsa Lanchester playing Mary Shelley in the beginning as well as the bride later in the film. Directed by James Whale, this Carl Laemmle production has garnered much praise and fanfare over the decades. In a neat and tidy continuation of events, the film picks back up with the ending of the first movie, the windmill is burning with Frankenstein's monster atop it. This is Shelley continuing the Frankenstein tale to a group of friends on a stormy night in the present, and the movie being her telling. It's expressly stated by the fictional Shelley that she intended for the story to be a moral lesson and that a common misconception is calling the monster himself Frankenstein. The townspeople believe that the monster died in the fire that burned the mill to the ground. But the father of the little girl who drowned in the first film wants confirmation. Hans, the father, travels into the ruin only to fall right into the monster's hiding place. The monster strangles Hans and his wife to death, wiping out the entire family in less than 48 hours. Having thought Frankenstein had died, Elizabeth is overjoyed to learn he's still alive, so much so that upon a warning that the monster lives, no one listens. Henry is sticking steadfast to his mission, however, and still feels destined to unlock the secrets of life, and renounces his creation without relinquishing his obsession. Henry's mentor, Dr. Septimus Pretorius, arrives at the castle and shows him what he calls homunculi, which are small, fully formed humans popular during the times of alchemy. Pretorius convinces Henry that they should work together to create a second creature, but this time Pretorius intends to grow an artificial brain. Henry is tasked with getting the body parts while Pretorius works on the artificial brain. While in the woods, the monster saves a woman from drowning, but this is confused for attacking her when two hunters happen upon them and chase the monster after shooting him. Upon catching him, he's chained, only to display the strength and ability to break and escape. This ends up with the monster finding an old hermit who's blind and just happy to have a friend in the vicinity. The man teaches him the word friend and feeds him, but the lost hunters stumble upon them and end that union. The cottage is burned down in the scuffle, and the hunters and hermit are safely outside, aware now that the monster is near and more incensed and fearful. While they lead the hermit away, the monster hides out in a crypt, only to witness Pretorius and his two henchmen robbing the grave of a young woman. The men leave and Pretorius stays, ending up talking to the monster about his plans to create a second creature. Henry refuses to complete the work, and Pretorius reveals that the monster is involved and also demands that Henry help in response to that. Pretorius then signals to the monster to carry out a plan to abduct Elizabeth, Henry's wife, as of very recently, in order to force Henry to complete the creation. Once Henry has agreed to assist in the experiment, they prep and a storm rolls in for them to take advantage of. Lightning strikes on the contraption above the raised metal table, electrifying the body of the creature wrapped from head to toe in bandages. When she reaches the ground again, they realize they have a success. The bride is alive. Pretorius and Henry unwrap her, revealing an absolutely stunning character, the bride of Frankenstein, which Pretorius shouts upon confirmation she lived. Black hair swept up behind her head with white streaks in it sprouting from her electrified temples. She's twitchy and hesitant, dressed in floor-length gown with a sharp stitch line carving her jaw. She is fabulous. The monster arrives shortly after her reveal, reaching for her and saying "friend" in a hopeful manner. Fortunately for everyone, the bride is less than impressed with the monster and she recoils away from him towards Frankenstein. Her rejection causes him to state that she hates him and is like the others, realizing that he can't force someone to accept him. The monster decides to smash the lab up, shouting to Henry and Elizabeth that they should go because they live, and in contrast, the monster tells Pretorius and the bride that they belong dead and are staying. The monster pulls a lever that brings on the castle's destruction, along with the laboratory and the experiments inside. Following success with the other Universal Pictures horror films, Dracula's Daughter premiered in 1936. It is debated what the actual source material for the movie is. American Film Catalog's page dedicated to the film states that it's thought to be based on an unpublished story from the novel titled Dracula's Guest, while other more modern sources claim it's based on the 1872 novel Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, which is famous for its subject matter of lesbian relationships, the first novel of its kind in British fiction. By 1936, when this movie premiered, various other monster movies had premiered to varying degrees of success. One thing rang true for Universal towards the end of the Great Depression. Horror movies are cheap to make and turn a profit, even during the worst of times. Not only are they cheap to make, but the source material from the Gothic area made perfect blueprints for the base stories of each monster. After the initial monster movie stories expanded in the Dracula's Daughter is known to have themes of homosexuality and patriarchy, focusing on Countess Zaleska, whom is the daughter of Dracula seeking to cure her thirst. She seeks help from Dr. Garth, a man she meets at a society party once she arrives in town, who instantly falls for the Countess. Garth walks the Countess through a type of conversion therapy, but she succumbs to her urges and attacks a young woman that her helper, Sandor, recruits for her. Under the guise of needing models for her paintings, the Countess is able to lure victims in who are likely to trust her because she is a woman of nobility. It's obvious from the first few scenes that the Countess isn't as proud of her vampirism as her father, the Count, had been. Rather than wanting to completely indulge in her bloodthirst, she hopes that when he dies and she burns his body, she's free from his curse. Towards the 3/4 mark in the movie, the tone from the Countess changes. She becomes more of herself and definitive about succumbing to her bloodthirst and attacking a woman that ends up recounting the tale to the doctor and the authorities before passing. Dr. Garth and his secretary have an unusual relationship, to say the least, and in order to lure him to the castle in Transylvania, the Countess abducts Janet. Garth chases the Countess to the castle, realizing he cares about his secretary despite their more antagonistic than harmonious relationship. The Countess demands that Garth becomes her eternal partner and become a vampire in exchange for letting Janet, Garth's secretary, free. The plan isn't carried out, though. The Countess is killed by her now disloyal servant Sandor because she had promised him eternal life, only for her to take on this side quest. Before Sandor can kill Garth and Janet as well, he's killed by a policeman accompanied by Van Helsing. Dracula's Daughter is one of my favorites of these 30s and 40s monster movies. Gloria Holden's performance as the Countess is spectacular and hard to look away from, giving the sense that she possesses a hypnotic glare even stronger than her father's. The approaches are just as the amplified and fear factor that has withstood the test of time. Holden's magnetism and chemistry can be felt in each scene regardless of who she's acting with. The only actors with more chemistry are Otto Kruger, who played Dr. Jeffrey Garth, and Marguerite Churchill, who played Janet Blake, the doctor's secretary. Something I've noticed about older movies that is a bit of a viewing learning curve for me is that key details will be given one time only through something like a sign in the background or a random conversation. I thought that older movies just didn't care about details as much and lore, but in fact they just display it to the audience in far different ways. Once I realized how off I'd been, things made much more sense as far as plots, monsters, abilities, and especially characters, relationships, and histories. At the end of the previous Frankenstein movie, the monster burned the lab down with both himself and the bride inside with the mad scientist. We flash forward years after that event with Henry Frankenstein's son, Baron Wolf von Frankenstein, played by Basil Rathbone. The new generation of Frankensteins has arrived back in their ancestral home, only to realize the entire town despises them and is wary of their arrival. The policeman Inspector Craw lost his arm as a child to the Frankenstein monster but befriends the family in spite of its history. The inspector does, however, warn Baron Wolf that his attempt to repair his father's reputation in the village won't be met with acceptance from the townspeople. When Baron Wolf arrives at the castle with his wife Elsa and son Peter, he finds Igor, who is the man hung for grave robbing that survived the hanging with a neck deformity. He also finds the monster's body in the crypt that he decides to revive in his family's name. Despite Wolf being able to revive the monster, it is under Igor's command, who is directing it to murder all the men in town who sentenced him to death. Due to the obvious connection, Wolf puts two and two together and confronts Igor and shoots him. In revenge for killing Igor, the monster takes Peter, Wolf's son. A fight ensues after the men, Inspector Craw and Baron Wolf, chase the monster to the laboratory. The monster is knocked into the molten sulfur pit that is beneath the lab after he tears off Craw's arm, poetic justice for the inspector. Following the events, the Frankenstein family decide to leave the village after all, which causes the townspeople to cheer. In a gesture of good faith, Baron Wolf leaves the castle to the village people who he believes are the rightful owners and protectors. One monster I find to not be scary with no hope of having fixed it, on the other hand, is the Wolfman, or Lawrence Larry Talbot, first appearing in the 1941 film of the same name. It might be due to the makeup of the time or the direction of the performance not feeling like it always matched the actor Lon Chaney Jr. I don't know. It might have been due to Hays Code or maybe just capabilities and technological advancements, but the Wolfman looks like a caricature to my modern mind. It comes off as the safe version of the Universal Monster movies. The story is created entirely by the studio in this case, however, and in spite of this, the story is decent and still accomplishes the gothic themes and elements like the other movies. Larry Talbot returns to his home in Wales after his brother dies to be there for arrangements and to reconcile with Sir John, his father, the lord of the estate. Shortly after arriving, he meets Gwen Conleaf, played by Evelyn Angers, who works at a local antique store and is instantly smitten with her. Under the guise of looking for a new walking stick, he attempts to flirt with Gwen and ends up purchasing one with a giant silver wolf hand grip. The local superstition states that a werewolf is a man that becomes a wolf, and also mentions that they see a pentagram on the palm of the next victim. Gwen nonetheless agrees to meet with him after work to go get their fortunes told by Romany people who are nearby. Gwen brings her friend Jenny, and they visit Bella, who sees a pentagram in her hand when he goes to give her a palm reading in his caravan. Meanwhile, Gwen and Larry are walking around chatting about her engagement and are interrupted by Jenny screaming. They rush to her aid as she's attacked by a wolf, and Larry jumps in to try and rescue her. Larry is able to kill the wolf with his new walking stick, but sustains a bite from the wolf who is revealed to be Bela, the fortune teller. Gwen and Bela's mother, Mileva, take the injured Larry back to his estate where his chest wolf bite heals within the night. Now that the wolf has turned back into Bela upon his death, the people at the scene believe that Larry killed him. Things get worse for Larry when his bite heals and he's lost most, if not all, of the proof of battling a wolf and not a man. Gwen and Larry end up getting suspicion from the town about potentially having engaged in adultery when Jenny died, showing a stark consequence for the flirtation. Maleva tells Larry about the curse and Bela, along with warning him he's also cursed now, giving him a pendant that he re-gives to Gwen. He doesn't take Maleva seriously but transforms the next night, running out and killing a villager. Due to the attacks resembling that of a wolf, a hunting party is formed to track down the wolf. When things reach a fever pitch, Larry confesses to his father that he's the werewolf, but his father doesn't believe him and instead straps him to a chair, believing he's lost his mind. Upon the full moon, he transforms, however, and attacks Gwen, the pentagram having shown her in palm earlier, and his father, not recognizing him, kills him with his silver, wolf-headed walking stick. The Universal monster represents what the studio felt would be most successful during this time. What story and character could they create that is low budget but a box office hit? That makes a character an important control variable when examining what audiences connected with and looked for in horror movies during this time. Despite Frankenstein leaving at the end of Son of Frankenstein, the town left behind is famished at the start of The Ghost of Frankenstein, released in 1942. The townspeople staunchly believe that the monster caused a curse on the town that can only be resolved by blowing the castle up. The mayor tries to intercede on their plan, but is threatened he won't be re-elected if he stands in the way of this matter. Igor is still in the castle and is in fact not dead, sending pieces of stone from the top of the castle onto the townspeople below. The plan to blow up the castle is brought to fruition and Igor survives the blast. From the rubble, a hand is sticking out. The monster survived the pit and is now encased in material from it. Igor notes that the pit damaged but preserved him and breaks him free, both escaping the castle into the graveyard nearby while the townspeople continue destroying the castle. While Igor and the monster flee through the graveyard in the woods beyond it, lightning strikes his neck bolt, which at first Igor believes is bad but proves to be good. Igor explains that Frankenstein might have been his father, but lightning is his mother. The two plan to find Dr. Frankenstein, the other son of Henry Frankenstein's father, in order to help the monster. Dr. Frankenstein has a practice in Visaria where he sees those with quote-unquote diseased minds and is performing a first-of-its-kind brain surgery with his two assistants. One of his assistants, Bomber, is Frankenstein's former teacher, having made a serious error resulting in being Frankenstein's assistant instead. While Igor and the monster arrive in Visaria and the monster approaches children playing after a young girl's ball ends up on a roof. His interaction and the relationship with the little girl becomes the catalyst for a lot of events in the film. She's not a catalyst for Ludwig's purposes, however, which are to destroy the monster to turn him into a controllable experiment that can be further studied. Ultimately, the competing goals for the monster's body cause Igor's brain to be put into it by Bomber, having betrayed Frankenstein in order to redeem his reputation for the successful experimental surgery. Since the monster abducted the little girl prior to undergoing the surgical brain transplant, an angry mob has now formed, led by her father. Time has passed since the brain transplant, but originally her father had thought she had died in the fire the monster accidentally set when abducting her. The mob makes their way to the Frankenstein castle, and Igor, as the Frankenstein monster, has a plan to gas the townspeople that storm the castle. Fortunately, the little girl is still alive and inside the castle, Elsa bringing her down from somewhere. I might have missed it, but there didn't seem to be an explanation other than covering the monster's tracks to continue to hide the girl and let her father believe she died in the fire. It seems that things are going downhill and that Igor will have all the power of the monster's body with all the evil intentions he harbors. Suddenly, though, Igor starts to lose his sight, and it's revealed that the brain needed to be a direct blood-type match for the operation to fully work. Bomber is killed by falling into the machinery used to reanimate creatures. This scene in particular is top of mind in light of Taylor Swift's Fortnite music video, full of references to this time period of film, and more specifically Frankenstein films. Taylor Swift is strapped into the monster's spot with her head covered in metal machinery, the electrified machines behind her becoming deadly to the lab workers, similarly to Bomber. Normally I chalk things like this up to coincidence and being influenced by old Hollywood, like many things have been, but with T Swift's the symbolism, Easter eggs, and lore runs deep, then this is no different. The time period of these Universal monster movies based on the 19th century Gothic fiction is peak romanticism in the best ways, which is exactly the vibe of the Torture Poet Department's music video. In Ghost of Frankenstein, the monster goes up in flames of the laboratory, melted by the flames and buried in the falling infrastructure. The final scene is Elsa and policemen escaping into the scenery beyond the burning estate, cleansing with the destruction of fire, similar to how the tale ends in the first film, and many portrayals that align with that one. Another addition to the Dracula franchise is added Son of Dracula in 1943. Noticeably, in this film, all of the workers and servants around the estates and establishments are now set in America rather than various European locations. It also centers around a plantation that is passed from a father to his daughters upon his death. Kay is a badass goth queen dripping in romanticism. Catherine Caldwell inherits her father's plantation, Dark Oats, and is secretly dating a mysterious man, Alucard. Upon Alucard's arrival in town, Kay breaks off her engagement to longtime love Frank Stanley and hastily marries Alucard, who is actually Dracula spelled back. Frank believes he has killed Kay when he shoots Dracula and the bullets go directly through him, but Kay is actually a vampire now. Once Frank is jailed, she teleports his mist into his cell to inform him that she had a plan all along. She would become a vampire by seducing Dracula, then she would turn Frank into a vampire, and they will live together forever. Unfortunately for Kay and the plot, this movie was made during Hays Code's reign over Hollywood, and Frank betrays Catherine, setting her coffin on fire rather than joining her in eternal life. I can't help but wonder if this movie could have held up better without the restriction. It's clear that the intention of the creatives is to have Kay end up as a vampire with her love, or at the very least them dying together in a blaze of glory. The plot points in the same direction the entire time, up until the end when we must have the pious men protect Kay from herself, similarly to Lucy and Dracula, for fear of inciting such transgressions from audience members. Despite feeling this way, all's not well, however, with Kay portraying a victim when she's still villainous, especially in her scheming. First off, she tricks Dracula regardless of what Dracula's plans might have been, still not off to a great moral start. She then goes on to break her fiancé's heart in order to secure immortality, and then even still she leads her fiancé to believe he killed her only to reveal herself via mist in his jail cell. During his near break with reality, Kay informs Frank that she took the choice of becoming a vampire from him, having already drank his blood. I still would have wanted to see the more macabre ending, but this has potential and most likely removed. Hays Code, don't and be careful is all throughout it. Fears about Eastern European immigrants are replaced with ideas about a quote superior race, which comes up quite frequently. Noticeably in this film, all of the workers and servants around the estates and establishments are black actors rather than white actors as they've previously been for other films. This film is the most stark transition in my opinion from pre- and post-code horror films, even affecting the niche genre of the Little 3 studios. It's obvious there's friction between the studios and the creatives, the conflicting decision muddying the plot and causing unnecessary distractions from the scarier aspects. By 1943, with multiple monsters now introduced, Universal Pictures decided to combine monsters in the same film, starting a trend that would further build and solidify these characters as core classic horror figures and the horror genre as a whole. About 4 years after The Wolfman and The Ghost of Frankenstein, grave robbers are breaking into the Talbot family crypt and discover that Larry's tomb is full of wolfsbane. Since the introduction of the Wolfman as a character, a chant accompanies the legend, which the robbers recite at the grave. After this, and removing the wolfsbane, Larry grabs one of their arms. After being found by the police and taken to a hospital, doctors are extremely confused by Larry's miraculous survival of blunt force trauma to the head. He has a skull fracture and doesn't readily remember details, but turns into a werewolf and kills a policeman, which spurs his memory, reigniting his desire to be stopped from killing again. People don't believe him until they travel to his grave to investigate and find it empty. Maleva recommends that Larry seek the help of Dr. Frankenstein, and he goes to try and find the notes in the ruin of the castle. After posing a potential buyer, Elsa Frankenstein, Ludwig's daughter, returns to the estate to meet him, and he asks her about the note's hiding place. Despite her not agreeing to help him, they do agree to attend a festival together. Dr. Mannering wants Larry to commit himself to a hospital before the next full moon, and has tracked him across Europe. After the monster crashes the festival and is attacked by the villagers, Mannering and Elsa agree to join the cause to stop the monster. Mannering is pretending to be able to help Larry to lure him to the ruin where he and Elsa plan to drain the life out of both monsters. Mannering's curiosity gets the best of him, and he decides to fully revive the monster rather than draining his life force like he'd agreed to. It doesn't matter who is betraying who, however, because the innkeeper suspects they're all in cahoots and blows the dam that overlooks the estate, flooding the ruins. Elsa and Mannering escape, but due to their fighting, the Wolfman and Frankenstein's monster are swept away. In an entirely new storyline, we meet Dr. Gustav Niemann, who is imprisoned for trying to recreate Frankenstein's experiments. Alongside him is a hunchback named Daniel that becomes Neiman's assistant in exchange for the promise of the doctor, quote-unquote, fixing his deformity. Of course, the fix has been the subject for Neiman, successfully transplanting a brain from one body to another. After escaping the prison together and being believed to be dead, the pair aids duck carriage, which results in their invitation inside Lampini's living cart. Part of Lampini's traveling show of horrors is Dracula's skeleton, staked inside of his coffin. When the subject comes up, Lampini talks smack about Neiman and his reputation, and Neiman instructs Daniel to murder him and the driver so they can assume their identities. Upon assuming their identities, Neiman begins to plan how to exact revenge on the men who imprisoned him. After running Lampini's horror show in his place and surviving vocal suspicion from Inspector Ons in front of the Burgomaster. After they leave the caravan, the doctors pull the stake from Count Dracula's heart, which revives him. The special effects are practical. What appears to be various slides transitioned over one another go from skeletal to the actor. The Count and Neiman strike up a deal that Neiman will always make sure that Dracula's coffin is safe during the daylight hours and ready for him when he returns. Dracula agrees to revenge kill Burgomaster Hussman for Neiman and introduces himself to them as Baron Latos while offering a ride in his carriage. Diverting from the plan, Dracula becomes obsessed with Rita, the Hussman's son's wife. He decides to seduce Rita and make her wear his ring and show her his world, which he describes as full of dead people. Dracula proceeds with the plan, however, after securing his next chosen victim and transforms into a bat and kills the Burgomaster. After Dracula abducts Rita, a chase ensues following his carriage, and when Neiman and Daniel realize the heat is coming from Dracula and they are virtually undetected, they unload Dracula's coffin from their carriage. Right as they ditch him, Dracula's carriage crashes, and before he can get inside his coffin, the sun rises, causing him to become a skeleton again. Once Dracula is dead, Rita is freed from his ring's grip and returns to a normal state, reunited with her husband and safely with the police. Neiman and Daniel make it to Frankenstein's village with the intention to find the doctor's research notes to assist in his own experiments. They come across a group of Romanian people, all traveling by caravan, and some of which putting on shows and attractions near the ruins of the Castle Frankenstein. The local police near the ruins don't want anyone around the area, however, noting that every time someone comes around there, something terrible happens to the village. They also won't let the crew stay, but despite the dispute, Daniel's having his Romeo moment and falls instantly for a dancer. Following a dispute over her earnings, a man in the caravan group starts whipping her, which Daniel saves her from. Daniel goes on to introduce himself when she wakes up, only for her to be uninterested when she learns of his disability. The doctor and Daniel then make it to the castle ruins and are able to find the frozen Frankenstein monster and the Wolfman in the ice caves below. Larry survives the melting with ease, transforming back into his human form and picking right back up in his lamenting whines. Frankenstein's monster, however, is intact but won't wake, and Neiman promises to place Larry's brain into the monster's body in order to overcome the werewolf curse. Once the new squad finds Frankenstein's journals, they all travel to Visaria, where Neiman's own lab is. On the journey, Ilonka falls in love with Larry, after Neiman tasks Daniel with caring for the monster. With all of the main characters now together, the real challenges the characters face comes to the forefront. Somehow all of that was just set up for the main plot of the movie, which is the battle for the monster's body and eventual revival of the monster. Physical, moral, and ethical implications play out throughout their time in Visaria, while prepping for some sort of revival of the monster. In addition to the issues surrounding the monster, Lawrence transforms into the Wolfman, murdering locals. The Wolfman story culminates with Ilonka shooting him with the silver bullet while he goes to attack her, resulting in both dying. When Daniel discovers their bodies, he snaps, confronting Neiman in the lab. The monster wakes up and tosses Daniel out of there with no resolution to his discontent, and villagers arrive and spot Frankenstein's monster. With the knowledge that the monster hates fire, they chase him into the woods near the castle and set the marsh grass on fire. The fire chase forces Frankenstein's monster into quicksand like mud, and while still carrying Neiman, he plunges into it and begins sinking. Frankenstein's monster and Neiman sink under the surface, presumably dead. An abrupt "the end" flashes on the screen once the camera pans slightly up from the quicksand where the other monster had just stood. So much happens in this movie from start to finish that it is commonly used for clips of the monster and Dracula as well as the Wolfman with Ilonka. By far, this is one of the best movies in the series, despite being a little disjointed in how we get to the end outcome. The immediate ending after the rising action did leave me jaw-dropped and confused, however. It's easy to expect modern conclusions and forget that the viewers of the past weren't necessarily as interested in the aspects I found most interesting now, like the ending and possible epilogue. Fortunately, some resolution exists in the next film that features them, titled House of Dracula, one of the most well-known Universal monster films. House of Dracula came out in 1945 and jumps right into the action with the Count casing a castle in Vassaria. At Dr. Edelman's home around sunrise, Dracula pleads for him to be allowed to rest in his coffin in the basement. Dracula explains that he comes to the doctor in hopes he can be freed of the curse that causes him to be a vampire. Edelman doesn't believe him, however, but does believe that he's a crazy man who has tricked himself into thinking he needs blood to survive. Edelman is someone who plans to help a multitude of Universal monsters, including Larry, arriving flustered and desperately requesting help to either end his life or the curse. Edelman gets to work searching for cures to the various curses that plague the monsters, as well as a way to fix his assistant Nina's hunchback. While Edelman is researching what could be causing Dracula's vampirism, he's seducing the other lab assistant, Miss Morel, with his ring. The doctor identifies a parasite in Dracula's blood and pressure in the Wolfman's skull that could be related to their respective curses. This is the first time in the films that we get indications of a scientific nature for the root of their ailment. Through the development of Wolfsbane serum in the lab, the doctor thinks he can stop Larry from transitioning into a werewolf. For Dracula's treatment, he prescribes blood transfusions to try and get rid of the parasite. Despite having recovered somewhat from his vampirism with the treatment, his reflection disappears again as he ramps up his hypnosis of Melissa. They start to catch on to Dracula after he makes Morel throw her cross away from her so that he can have free reign over her. With his next victim lined up and ulterior motives, Dracula agrees to the next blood transfusion, but causes Edelman to pass out. Once Edelman and Nina are out, Dracula reverses the blood transfusion valve so that his blood goes into the doctor's body. Now fully back to his vampiric ways, the Count turns into a bat and goes to Morel's room only to be chased out with a crucifix. Edelman keeps up the chase all the way to the Dracula's crypt in the basement, where he's fleeing to as sunrise approaches. Dracula's inside the casket when Edelman moves it into the sunlight and opens it, causing him to die once again, leaving just his skeleton and his ring on his finger. Once Dracula is dead, Melissa returns to normal and is now free from his spell and hypnosis. Larry, having joined the fight at Nina's begging to do so, is there to comfort her as the doctor starts to transform. In a really cool dreamlike sequence, Edelman begins to become a vampire and sees his reflection disappear and then imagining a dark version of himself coming to him. In his mind, the two versions are the devil and angel on someone's shoulder. An evil scientist version of himself that aims to resurrect the Frankenstein monster and fix Nina's hunchback so he can attack her, being the devil. Edelman considers becoming immortal and continuing the work of Frankenstein, starting to rant and rave similarly to the other scientists who succumb to the pull of the experiments. Nina comes to the doctor's lab and demands that Larry receive the next available treatment before the full moon. We hear from Larry that he now associates the moon with evil and darkness, expressing his guilt and despair. The townspeople believe that Edelman is Talbot, a werewolf, but despite efforts, they haven't been able to apprehend him. The operation cures Larry of his werewolf curse, but Edelman is becoming the monstrous, evil version of himself as he revives Frankenstein's monster. The doctor kills Nina only to end up being shot and killed by Larry, who then sets fire to the lab, trapping the monster in the flames before the roof collapses. The second video that I am planning to post at the end of July will cover Dracula portrayals from 1958 through 1979, including the blaxploitation ones like Blackula, the Frankenstein movies from 1948 to 1992, and the Wolfman movies from 1961 to 2004. At the end of this December, the final part of the series will be posted. The final video will cover related video games, some other interpretations of vampires, and the Dracula story, twists on Frankenstein movies like Frankenweenie and Lisa Frankenstein, and werewolf movies like Underworld and Van Helsing. Included in this video will be a Nosferatu 2024 review and any information available at the time about the upcoming Wolfman 2025 movie release. Between now and then, I'm planning to post at least one video a month, if not more, depending on life circumstances. For the month of May video, I will be trying to topic one of my favorites, Jennifer's Body, and movies like Ginger Snaps and Carrie. Currently, I have an article on my website, www.redrosehorror.com, covering Jennifer's Body, which will most likely be the same content featured in that video.